certain characteristic features, certain common characteristics that you find in all these plays. Of course, it's comedy. So, one of the common characters or sets of characters that we find here is the lovers. You have lovers. Sometimes they could be one pair, and sometimes they could be pairs of lovers. I'm sure you can think of a play like The Tempest. It would come to mind, and if you have a quick look and try to understand what the play is about, you would know when I say pairs of lovers. Many more you would be able to remember when you think of Shakespeare. So, there would be here characters, situations, mistaken identities, disputes within a family, and of course, something common that links all of them, interestingly, is a clever servant. He is a part of many of the Shakespearean comedies, also a part of what I refer to as the romantic comedy. Can we move on to the next kind of comedy? Let me say something more about the romantic comedy before I move on to the next, because there are characteristics which bind all these comedies together. And so some other characteristics of the Shakespearean comedy or the romantic comedy: number one, multiple intertwining plots. So if something is happening to Orlando, the same thing is happening to Oliver. Do you know which play I'm talking about? Well, that's a guessing game. Go home and check your books to see which Shakespearean comedy I'm talking about. So you have Orlando and Oliver. Maybe a little more clue, my dear students. Do you remember Rosalind? Come on, go and check, or rack your brains to know which Shakespearean comedy I'm talking about. There is also a lot of laughter. There's earthy humor. There is bantering, where you playfully talk to each other in English, in everyday colloquial language. You could say pulling each other's legs. That too happens a great deal in a lot of romantic comedy, and Shakespeare was a great master at doing this. I could go on and on about Shakespearean comedy because, after all, Shakespeare was a great dramatist, unparalleled in the history of English drama. But then, my dear students, I have to remember your syllabus. I have to remember the clock ticking away. And so let me go on to the next type of comedy, and that is sentimental comedy. Don't get confused, my dear students, because sometimes we refer to it as this anti-sentimental comedy, and sometimes we call it the sentimental comedy. And you might ask yourself, how can sentimental and anti-sentimental be the same? After all, when we use the word anti, isn't it supposed to be the opposite? Right? You are absolutely right. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about moving away from restoration drama, moving away from the immorality that we associated, and coming to the sentimental or the anti-sentimental comedy. This was popular. This was a favorite of some of the dramatists of the 18th century. We have to understand that this comedy specifically talked about, had characters who were from the middle class. What happens to them? They face a series of moral trials. What does that mean? What is right? What is wrong? What should I do? Should I side with this character or that character? Am I right in thinking so? What is moral? What is immoral? They have a lot of questions that they ask themselves, and a lot of this comedy is born out of this conflict. And sometimes, why do we refer to it as sentimental? Because it also brings out tears. We smile through our tears. The greatest songs, right, which tell of our saddest thoughts. So here, it's laughter. But along with laughter, there are also tears. And I'm thinking of somebody like Goldsmith, and I'm thinking of his novel here, rather than his play. To make you understand what exactly I mean by this point, you just have to read The Vicar of Wakefield to understand what I'm talking about. You can't read it, no problem. Read the synopsis. Read in short what this novel is all about, and you will understand what the sentimental comedy or what Goldsmith is trying to do in his plays. So, what did it do? It appealed to the noble sentiments. It also suggested that it was possible for a so-called black-souled man, that is what we would call probably a sinner, probably somebody who's doing wrong, probably somebody who is a criminal, not a great criminal, not a terrible criminal, but somebody who is doing wrong, you attempt to set him on the right path. And the best example of the sentimental comedy is, of course, Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer. The characters sometimes are so virtuous, that they cause laughter. Because remember, as a great philosopher said once, we need to walk on the golden mean. Choose the center path, neither too much nor too little of anything. So, when something, even good, becomes too much, it can evoke laughter. So that is the sentimental comedy. Remember, we are looking at different kinds of comedy, different types of comedy. And when I started, I began with the Elizabethan age, right? I did give you a little bit about what happened earlier when I talked about mystery and morality plays, etc. But when we began looking at comedies, we really began by talking about the dark comedy. But before I talk about the dark comedy, let me just give you a couple of points about the comedy of ideas, the comedy of George Bernard Shaw, where what Shaw was really attempting to do was to look at the essential social evils of the time, the essentially important problems, social, economic, political, and to use his drama, to use his plays as a platform to give us an idea of how these have to be reformed, of how these have to be changed. I'm talking about the comedy of ideas, my dear students, before I start talking about the dark comedy, because I want to tell you that the comedy of ideas coexisted or just pre-existed with the comedy of Menace, the dark comedy, the black comedy, whatever you want to call it, because they're all kinds of comedy, the same kind of comedy, I would say, with very, very slight variations. So, remember, when you look at any of Bernard Shaw's plays, it becomes important to understand what is the idea that he is talking about. We could talk about, let us say, Pygmalion, where he's talking about the classes, the social classes, the divisions of society into the educated and the uneducated, or the rich and the poor. And according to Shaw, it is language which is either a great dividing factor or a great binding factor. If we belong to the same social class, Shaw believes, we would be speaking the same kind of language. How right or wrong Shaw was is not a point of debate in this lecture. But if you look at the play Pygmalion, you will understand what exactly I am saying. If you look at a play like Arms and the Man, my dear students, you will see what his views are on war and love. Remember, our concept of heroism, our concept of true love, etc., are very often highly romanticized. And here I'm using the word romanticized, my dear students, to refer to something that is not based on reality. So here I'm using the word romanticized as an antonym for realistic. What do I mean by that? When you look at Rainer and Sergius and Bluntschli, some of you might have read the play, some of you might have heard of the play Arms and the Man. So what is Shaw doing here? he makes fun of, he laughs at our concept of love and war, and uses the characters in the play to show what really love is or what really war is. So here you have the hero of a war. No, not really the hero, because the hero probably is Sergius and Major Petkoff. But you have this protagonist of the play, Blunchley, who prefers to carry chocolates in his pocket rather than carry cannon, rather than carry bullets, because he believes that he would need chocolates if he has to stay alive. And that, my dear students, brings me and you to the last type of comedy that I want to talk about today. I now talk about the dark comedy. Remember, I'm saying it again, in some book it could be referred to as the black comedy. Some of the writers of the dark comedy might prefer to be called writers of the comedy of Menace. And closely linked to that is what we today call the theatre of the absurd. How can humor be black? How can humor be dark, you might ask? You know, students, if you've heard of this word, which I'm sure you have by the time you've come to this semester, I'm sure you've heard of a word, a term, a philosophical term, but which we link to literature also, is the term existentialism, right? So the dark comedy, somewhere along the line, has its roots in this idea of existence. And these dramatists, a dramatist like Pinter maybe, a dramatist like Beckett maybe, you know what they are doing? They are looking at life with a sense of despair, with a sense of hopelessness, with a tragic vision. You might ask me, how then, ma'am, do you call it comedy? Because there is nothing that you can do about it except have a rueful, wry smile. Yes, wry and rueful. And I'm using the word wry, my dear students. I hope you know the spelling is W-R-Y. The English language has ever so many words where the first letter is not pronounced. The simple word which you use so often is the word right. You might also remember words which begin with KN. Knowledge and know and knee and knit. So is the word wry. I'm saying the word again and again. But you did see it on one of the earlier slides. And you probably know I'm using the word W-R-Y. It is pronounced wry. So we laugh. This is the dark comedy. The comedy of Menace, like the birthday party. A terrible, terrible play. Terrible because it fills you with a kind of hopelessness for the human situation. I'm sure life is not so bad, but the dramatist is pointing out to us a kind of life which is possible. Characters who have to face that kind of menace. You don't know where the danger is coming from. You don't know what might attack you when. So, these plays have in them a note of skepticism, a note of cynicism, a feeling that things can never be good, an idea that human life is a hopeless situation, a feeling that characters can never be truly happy, an idea, a philosophy, can I call it, where characters probably smile for a short period between long periods of grieving and sorrow and fear and despair. Now these characters, the characters in these plays are disillusioned. You might say one should always hope. You might like to quote, hope springs eternally in the human heart. But my dear students, the characters that we see in this kind of comedy, the dark comedy, the black comedy, are characters who are highly disillusioned. Life has not been kind to them. And therefore, we see shocking, we see horrific experiences. And it is not their fault. It is all because of fate. it seems as if they can do nothing about it. It seems as if the writers, the dramatists who write this kind of comedy are fatalistic in their approach. You might remember a great novelist, Thomas Hardy. My dear students, in this lecture, what I've really tried to do, though you might say there is so much more that we want to know, yes, remember this lecture gives you an idea of what you have to be looking at. What should you be looking at? The types of comedy. We, in this lecture and in lectures like this, give you the main points. Remember, it is not possible to do everything in an hour's lecture. But I'm sure this lecture will take you forward and make you read, make you talk to your colleagues or maybe to your professors and understand more about types of comedy. It's been an interesting lecture for me, and I do hope, my dear students, you have found it interesting and useful as well. Thank you and goodbye.
Sandhan, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.